There are moments in a man's life that happen faster than thought. Not decisions, just reactions. The body moves before the mind has time to argue, and it is only afterward, when the dust has settled and the heart rate drops back to something close to normal, that a man realizes what he has done. Wade Callahan had lived long enough on the high desert to understand that most of those unthinking moments pass without consequence. But on the morning the river ran brown and swollen through the canyon below his property, the split-second choice he made would follow him for months. It would change the way he slept, the way he scanned the ridgeline at dusk, and ultimately, the way he understood the difference between peace and safety. Because those two things, he would come to learn, are never quite the same thing. The Gila River had been climbing for 3 days before that morning. Late summer storms had pushed hard through the mountains to the north, and by the time all that water reached the lower country where Wade ran his cattle, the current had turned from a gentle, sandy-bottomed crossing into something muscular and unforgiving. Wade had already moved his herd back from the lower pasture as a precaution. He knew what a flooded river could do to cattle that wandered too close to the bank. He had learned that lesson the hard way years earlier, and he had no interest in repeating it. So that morning, with the sky still pale and the air carrying that particular desert smell of wet rock and ironwood, he rode the fence line along the upper bank just to satisfy himself that everything was in order. He had no particular reason to expect anything unusual. He never did on mornings like that. He heard the horse before he saw it. A sound that cut clean through the rush of the water, high, sharp, desperate. Not the sound a horse makes when it is spooked by a snake or a shadow, but the sound one makes when it has gone past fear into something closer to raw terror. Wade turned his own horse toward the sound without thinking and pushed through a stand of cottonwoods to the edge of the bank, where the ground dropped away sharply to the churning water below. What he saw stopped him cold for just a moment. A paint horse, young by the look of it, had gone into the river, probably at what had been a safe crossing point 2 days earlier, and was now caught in the heavy current, struggling to keep its head above water. Its legs were working, but the current was pulling it sideways and downstream, and with every second it was losing ground. And on the bank, maybe 30 feet from where Wade had stopped, a girl stood at the edge watching it. Apache, from the way she was dressed, from the pattern of her clothing. She was not crying out. She was not panicking in the way that people often do when they cannot help something they love. She was simply watching, and that stillness was somehow worse than screaming would have been. Wade did not weigh the situation. He did not think about the current or the depth or the fact that a flooded desert river has no interest in the plans of the people who try to cross it. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle, took 3 wraps around the horn, and pushed his horse off the bank. The cold of the water hit him like a wall. His horse lunged and found its footing, then lost it, then found it again, and Wade kept his weight forward and his eyes on the paint horse fighting the current ahead of him. The rope in his hands was a problem. He had one chance to throw it accurately, and the current was making both horses move in ways that were hard to predict. He waited until he was close enough to be sure, and then he threw. The loop caught on the paint horse's neck on the first try, and Wade's horse dug in, and for a long moment nothing seemed to happen except that the river kept pulling and the rope went rigid as iron, and then by degrees the paint horse began to move against the current toward the bank. It took time, more time than it felt like it should have. When the paint horse finally scrambled up onto solid ground, shaking and blowing hard, Wade was soaked through and his arms ached from holding tension on the rope. He dismounted on the bank and stood breathing for a moment, water running off his hat brim and pooling in the red dirt around his boots. When he looked up, the girl was already at the paint horse's head, running her hands along its neck and flanks, checking it over with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been raised around horses and understood them the way other people understand close friends. The horse was shaken, but sound. No broken legs, No gashes from rocks in the current. Lucky by any reasonable measure. The girl looked at Wade. She said nothing for a long moment. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was careful, the way people look when they are trying to read a situation that does not fit neatly into the categories they have been given. Then she gave a single slow nod. Wade nodded back. There was nothing obvious to say, and neither of them tried to say it. He pulled his rope free from the paint horse's neck, coiled it back up, and swung onto his own horse. By the time he looked back from the tree line, she was already riding north, the paint horse moving steadily beside her at the end of a lead rope, wet but alive. Wade told himself that was the end of it. He was wrong about that too. If you are enjoying this story, go ahead and drop a like on the video. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Settle in, because the part that changes everything is still coming. For the first 2 days after the river, life on the Callahan property went on the way it always had. Wade fixed a section of fence along the east pasture that had been loose since spring. He checked on the cattle twice a day. He cooked his meals alone in the small kitchen at the back of his house and went to sleep when the sky went dark and got up when it went light again. He was a man of habit by nature and necessity. The ranch demanded a certain rhythm, and he had long since stopped resisting it. He did not think about the girl at the river in any sustained way. It crossed his mind the way most things did out there on the high desert, briefly and without fanfare, and then other concerns pushed it aside. On the third morning he counted the riders from the porch before they reached the gate. 7, all mounted, all Apache. Moving at a walk, which meant they were not in a hurry. Which meant, Wade reasoned, that they had already decided what they intended to do before they arrived, and were not being driven by the kind of urgency that leads men to make mistakes. That was either a reassuring thought or a very troubling one, depending on how you looked at it. Wade set down his coffee cup on the porch railing and picked up the rifle that leaned against the wall beside the door. He did not point it at anything. He just held it, because a man standing in front of 7 riders without any visible means of defense is not making a statement about peace. He is making a statement about weakness, and those two things tend to produce very different outcomes. The riders stopped at the gate. One of them, older, with silver in his hair and the kind of face that has been weathered by decades of sun and wind and the particular exhaustion that comes with leading people through hard years, urged his horse forward a few steps and spoke. His English was deliberate, each word placed with care, the way a man speaks a language he knows well but has chosen to use sparingly. Wade is what he said. And then he said the word that made Wade's throat tighten just slightly. The man said, "Warning." But what followed the word warning was not what Wade expected. The elder did not say, "Stay away from our people," or "You have no business near our land," or "The next time things will go differently." What he said, after a pause that stretched out long enough to make the silence feel like a third presence between them, was this: "The river is not the only thing you need to watch. There are men coming through this territory who are not moving cattle and are not moving goods and are not moving toward any town that appears on any map. They have been following our trail for 4 days, and they have your fence line on one side and our hunting ground on the other. They will use both. That is what you need to know." Wade stood still on the porch for a moment. Then he said, "How many?" The elder held up both hands, fingers spread. 10, maybe more, moving at night. Wade looked past the riders toward the southern horizon, where the land rolled out flat and dry and full of places where a group of men could move without being obvious about it. He knew that country. He had ridden it enough times to know its moods. And he knew that what the elder was describing was not difficult to imagine. The territory between the ranch and the Apache hunting grounds to the east was a natural corridor. sheltered from the main trail, rarely traveled by anyone who had lawful business in the area. If someone wanted to move through without being seen, that corridor was exactly where they would choose. He looked back at the elder. "Why tell me?" The older man's expression did not change. "Because my granddaughter asked us to." There was nothing Wade could say to that which would have made the moment any cleaner, so he said nothing. The elder held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode back to the group, and all 7 of them moved off to the north at the same unhurried walk they had arrived with. Wade watched them until they dropped below a swell in the land and disappeared from view. Then he stood alone on his porch in the morning quiet and thought about what it meant that a girl he had never spoken a word to, whose name he did not know, had gone back to her people and told them something about him that had made them ride 3 days to warn a white rancher about trouble he had not yet seen coming. He went inside and started checking his ammunition. By that evening, Wade had done what any man with sense would do when told that a group of unknown riders was working its way through his land at night. He rode the fence line all the way around the southern and eastern edges of the property, looking for sign. He found it sooner than he expected. Down in a dry wash that cut through the lower corner of his pasture, maybe half a mile from where the fence turned north, there were tracks. Unshod horses, which told him they were not a ranch outfit. Multiple riders moving in a loose group, which told him they were not trying to be invisible. They were simply trying to be quiet. The distinction mattered. A group trying to be invisible moves differently. They spread out. They use different routes. They avoid the places where tracks collect. These men were not doing any of that. They were moving with the easy confidence of people who had decided they did not need to hide because they did not believe anyone was watching. Wade rode back to the ranch house in the last of the daylight, turned his horse out into the corral, and sat on the porch until well after dark with the rifle across his knees. He did not see anyone. He did not hear anything unusual. But the knowledge that men were moving through that dark country below his fence line put a particular quality into the silence that he could not shake. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has things underneath it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There are more stories like this one, and you don't want to miss what happens next. The second night was different. Wade had barely been asleep 2 hours when the horses in the corral woke him. Not the ordinary restlessness of animals that have heard a coyote or caught the scent of something unfamiliar in the wind. This was sustained, directional, all of them pressed to the north side of the corral and looking south with their heads up and their ears fixed. Wade was out of bed and had the rifle in his hand before he was fully conscious of having made the decision to stand up. He went to the window first, which was the right thing to do, because going to a door in the dark when you do not know what is outside, it is the kind of decision that ends conversations permanently. From the window, he could see the south fence line in the moonlight, or enough of it to matter. 3 men were working the gate latch. They were not being careful about it, which told him they had already decided that speed was more important than silence, which meant they had either been watching the house long enough to believe he was asleep and unlikely to wake, or they had done this enough times in enough places that they had grown comfortable with the odds. Neither possibility was particularly reassuring. Wade pulled on his boots, went to the back door and stepped out into the dark on the far side of the house. The plan, such as it was simple. He circled wide around the back of the barn, moving through the dark on the assumption that the 3 men at the gate were not the only 3 men out there. If there were 10 of them moving through the territory, it was unlikely that 3 were working the gate, while the other 7 were doing something unrelated half a mile away. He moved low and slow and kept the barn between himself and the gate until he was at the far corner, and then he stopped and listened. What he heard confirmed what he suspected. There were men on the east side of the barn as well. 2 of them, from the sound of it, moving along the fence line toward the corral. They were after the horses. That was the shape of it. The cattle could be driven out slowly and quietly over days. Horses were faster, more valuable per animal, and easier to disappear across a territory where nobody was watching the high country. What happened next was not the result of a plan. It was the result of a sound. From the ridge to the north of the ranch house, the same ridge where the land rolled up into broken country that belonged to no particular rancher and had been Apache territory as long as anyone in the area could remember, a call came. High, clear, not quite human in the way that it carried and spread through the night air. It was answered immediately from the east, then from the south, and the sound did not belong to any bird that had business being awake at that hour in that country. The men at the gate stopped moving. The men along the east fence stopped moving. Wade did not stop moving. He stepped around the corner of the barn and put his back against the wall and waited. And what he heard over the next 2 minutes was the sound of horses being pushed hard through brush and gravel, moving south and away from the ranch as fast as their riders could manage in the dark. By the time the sky had turned gray at the eastern edge and the first birds had started making their ordinary morning noises in the cottonwoods by the dry creek, Wade's fence line was empty. His horses were still in the corral, and his cattle were where they had been the night before. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was in the dirt along the south fence, where the tracks of 3 horses came up to the gate and then turned hard and went south again without stopping, and in a small section of the east fence where a strand of wire had been cut and then apparently abandoned. Wade made coffee and stood on the porch and watched the light come into the sky the way it does in high desert country, fast and golden, and without any particular regard for the events of the night before. He was still standing there when he saw the rider coming down from the northern ridge. Alone. The paint horse was unmistakable at any distance. The patches of color stood out against the pale grass in a way that a solid-colored horse simply did not. She came down the slope at an easy pace and stopped at the gate without opening it, and Wade walked down from the porch and met her there. He had not expected to see her again. He realized now, standing at the gate with the coffee still warm in his hand, that some part of him had assumed the river and the riders and the warning were all pieces of something that had already finished, a brief disruption in the ordinary order of the days out here. He had been wrong about that, in the same way he had been wrong about the river being the end of it. The girl looked at him with those careful, reading eyes. She glanced at the cut wire along the east fence, then back at Wade. Then she said, in English, that was cleaner and more precise than he had expected. They are gone. At least for now. They will not come back to this specific place. It is no longer useful to them. They will find another corridor. Wade asked her how she knew where they would go next. She said her people had been watching that particular group for 8 days. They had a pattern. They avoided anything that had already seen them. They were disciplined in that way, even if they were not disciplined in other ways. Wade nodded slowly. He asked her name. She considered the question for a moment, in the way that people sometimes do when a question seems simple but carries something underneath it. Then she said, Nashota. It means 2. He did not ask why. Some things do not need explaining immediately. He introduced himself instead, and she repeated his name once, quietly, as though she was testing the sound of it against some internal standard. Then she said something that he found himself thinking about for a long time afterward. She said, my grandfather wanted to leave you to figure out the men yourself. He said a man who is not responsible for your safety has no business being warned about dangers on his own land. Wade waited. She continued, I told him that a man who rides into a flooded river without being asked has already shown us something about what kind of man he is, that it was worth the ride. There was nothing sentimental in the way she said it. It was an observation, the way you might note that the ground is wet after rain, or that a particular horse has a good disposition under pressure. Simply a thing that was true and worth saying. Wade appreciated that. Out there, in that country, At that time in the territory's history, there was a kind of clarity in plain speech that was rarer and more valuable than most people recognized. He asked her if her grandfather had agreed with her assessment. The faintest shadow of something, not quite a smile but related to one, crossed her face. She said, "He said it was a foolish thing I did, going into that crossing without knowing the river's mood. He said the horse was my responsibility, and I should have read the water better." Wade said, "He's not wrong." She said, "No, he is not, but he also rode here so." They stood at the gate in the early light for another minute or so, and the ordinary sounds of the morning came back around them. Birds, wind through dry grass, the restless shifting of horses in the corral. Wade asked if her people needed anything from the south pasture, water access or grazing, anything that a piece of fence might be preventing in a way that didn't need to be permanent. She looked at him for a moment, and there was something different in the look this time, something that had not been there before, a kind of recalibration. She said she would speak to her grandfather about it. Then she turned the paint horse and rode back up the slope toward the ridge, and Wade went back to the porch and finished his coffee and started his day. The next 3 weeks passed in the particular way that things pass in open country when something has changed, but the change has not yet fully declared itself. Wade repaired the east fence. He rode the south boundary twice and found no new tracks from the group that had come in the night. The territory was quiet in the way it gets quiet after something has been decided. Not the empty quiet of nothing happening, but the settled quiet of something having been resolved, at least temporarily. He ran into 2 riders from a neighboring spread one afternoon and mentioned, without specifics, that he had seen sign of a group moving through the lower corridor near his south fence. The riders passed the information along, and within a week, the local ranchers had collectively made enough noise about it to push that particular group further south and east toward country where the risks outweighed whatever they had been looking for. None of them knew the warning had originated with a girl on a paint horse who had nearly lost that horse to a river crossing gone bad. Wade did not correct that misunderstanding. About 6 weeks after the morning at the gate, he found a bundle left at his fence post near the north pasture. Wrapped in hide, tied with a cord, left without ceremony or note in the way that people sometimes leave things when they want the act to speak for itself without the complication of words around it. Inside was a piece of worked leather, a wide band, intricately decorated, the kind of craftsmanship that takes patience and skill, and a long familiarity with the material. It was the right size to serve as a rifle sling, and it had been made to serve exactly that purpose. Wade held it in his hands for a while in the morning light, turning it over, looking at the pattern of the work. He recognized, without being certain of the specific meaning, that it was the kind of thing that gets made carefully and deliberately, not quickly, not casually. He put it to use the same day. That fall, when the south water access became a question again, as the dry season pushed hard through the lower country, Wade opened a section of his south fence along the creek and left it that way through September and into October. He did not make an announcement about it. He did not send a message or a rider or a note. He simply opened the fence and left it open. And in the morning sometimes there would be sign along the creek bank that told him the water had been used in the night, and in the evening sometimes there would not be. Either way suited him. The land had water in it, and water in the desert belongs to whoever needs it badly enough to make the journey to find it. There was no grand agreement, no treaty, no ceremony of any kind. Just a rancher who had once ridden into a river without thinking about it, and a family of people who had ridden 3 days to warn a stranger, and between those 2 things a kind of understanding that did not need to be written down to be real. What he had learned, in the end, was something that the territory was not particularly good at teaching, but occasionally managed to convey through the right circumstances. That the people you treat with honesty, even when honesty costs you something, tend to be the people who show up when you need them most. Not because they owe you, not because you have made a transaction or signed a paper or shaken a hand in front of witnesses, but because the act of treating someone decently lodges itself somewhere in the record of things, and that record has a way of being consulted at moments that matter. The river had been the first line of it. Everything that followed had been the rest of the story. Out here in the Old West, in that cracked and sun-bleached and beautifully unforgiving country, the stories that lasted were never the ones about men who took the most or held the most or fought the hardest. They were the ones about men and women who recognized something human in a face that the world told them to see as foreign, and who acted on that recognition without waiting for permission. Wade Callahan was not a remarkable man by most measures. He had a modest spread and a modest herd, and no particular ambitions beyond keeping both intact through another season. But on one flooded morning on the Gila River, his body moved before his mind could argue, and what he pulled out of that current was not just a horse. If this story moved you in any way, leave a comment below and tell us. Would you have ridden into that river? Would you have opened that fence? We want to hear from you. And if you want more stories like this one from the real and complicated and quietly extraordinary history of the American frontier, subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell is a doorway into a world that deserves to be remembered. Not cleaned up, not simplified, but told the way it actually was, in all its dust and difficulty and unexpected grace. There are more of them waiting. Come back and hear them.